This is Fergus Hodgson on the Impunity Observer podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe. Go to impunityobserver.com/podcast for our archives. And you can follow us on YouTube, SoundCloud, and on all your podcast apps or feeds, right? So we have an old friend of mine and a brilliant author and journalist. His name is Martin Barillas, and he was a U.S. diplomat back in the 1980s and 90s, and he is now a journalist with churchmilitant.com and Zinger News. But what I want to explore today is his novel, Shaken Earth, which is set in Guatemala from memory the 1920s. I read this book a couple of years ago, and it is a fascinating, in-depth historical novel. So, Martin, welcome to the show, and let's get stuck into this fascinating book. So, a wonderful literary endeavor.
Well, thanks very much, Fergus. I appreciate it, and I want to extend my congratulations to you also for your own endeavors. I watch it your Twitter most every day, and I'm much the wiser each time I take a look.
Well, I appreciate that, and I should note that Martin is a brilliant linguist, and his book has smatterings of French and Spanish, and it's a beautifully rich endeavor, a rich piece of work. Now, so yeah, you can follow Martin on Twitter, and he gives, he's one of these few journalists who really shoots from the hip and just calls it as it is, which I appreciate so much. So, Shaken Earth, for people who have not been to Guatemala or lived there, what does Shaken Earth refer to? Why did you choose that title of your book?
Well, I studied anthropology in my youth, and it was perhaps a way of understanding the country where I spent so much of my growing up. I wasn't born there, but spent significant parts of my life there. There is a famous anthropological book. I can't remember the name of the author. It was called Sons of the Shaking Earth. And it's in a way a gloss on that. Volcanoes and earth tremors are an important part of the daily life of Central America. It's one of the most active seismic areas in the whole world. And it's a pity that there isn't more electricity generated by geothermal sources there. I wanted to call it Shaken Earth. There's an allusion to a passage in the Bible where it speaks to the shaking earth, and I see it as an allusion to higher powers, God looking on at his people, and it's set in 1932-33, and it follows the life of a young couple from the elites who have to meet with unexpected challenges and get unexpected help from in the midst of danger and upset.
Yeah, so forgive me, yeah. So not late 1920s, early 1930s. And it is a period it's the interwar period, right, leading into the Second World War, in a fascinating time in Guatemala's history. So yeah, let's just confirm there. I mean, I want to talk about, let me just clarify too my take on this Shaken Earth title about the volcanic activity. People might want to know that Antigua was the original capital of Guatemala, but there was such frequent earthquakes that people moved the capital to Guatemala City, which is today the capital. And still, the earthquakes and the volcanic activity are frequent, right? So when I was living there, I still remember vividly, I mean, there were earthquakes all the time, but one time we were out driving and the car was just going all over the place. We're thinking, what is going on with the vehicle? But of course, we looked to the right and the lights were all fluttering and moving in the streets beside us. So it is a part of daily life, and to such a degree that the cities in Guatemala have very short buildings because taller buildings will be vulnerable to this shaken earth. And I'm thinking maybe 3 years ago, there was such volcanic activity that many people died, and there was bad air pollution in the Guatemala city. I think the country club was overrun with lava. So it really is still to this day an important part of life in Guatemala. But so why don't you tell us then, you said you lived in Guatemala, but you were born in the United States. You have this deep, let's say, family lineage and connection to the country you care about deeply. So why don't you mention what makes you care so much about Guatemala and what it means to your family?
Well, my father was born and raised in Guatemala, and we came from a long line of, I guess, minor aristocrats, what the left would call the oligarchs. They came to Mexico in 1585, the first that we know of, and at about 1600, an ancestor was given a grant of land, an encomienda, as is said in Spanish, to an area not far from Guatemala City and along the lake Amatitlán. And our ancestors gave their name to the place, or Santa Elena Barillas. There's a little town there. They formed plantations there at Villa Canales and Villanueva, and prospered along the way. And then one of my ancestors had the idea of joining with the so-called reform, where the temporal power of the church was challenged. That was in the 1870s. The dictator Estrada Cabrera passed away, and the so-called reformers came in. Manuel Lisandro Barillas was the vice president, and when the president Barrios was invading El Salvador at Chalchuapa, that was in 1886, I believe, he was killed in battle. And my ancestor, Manuel Lisandro, came back to the capital and basically said, hey, I'm in charge, boys, make me president. And so he was, and he continued in the presidency for 6 years and voluntarily left. And one of his contributions was to bring in, to invite German, Belgian, American entrepreneurs to take over the lands that had been seized from the church and seized from the Indians and install coffee plantations, because he and the reformers saw that European business and businessmen would increase the fortunes of Guatemala. He left, and his successor, who was a relative of his, Reina Barrios, took over, but then he was murdered. And it was another president, his name escapes me now, who took over, who became one of the worst in Latin American history. And one of the things I like to say about Guatemala is that it forms a microcosm for understanding, or trying to understand, Latin American history. It figures in very prominently in the Spanish Conquest, when they brought in the Mexican allies in the 1500s to conquer the area. And I have family who descended from those Mexicans who came with Alvarado. So I've struggled to understand, certainly the conquest and all of that is remote, what was more present to me through my father was his participation at what was called the Revolution of 1954, and 44. 44 was the revolution when the dictator Ubico, who figures into my novel, was overthrown. And then a subsequent one in 54 when a leftist, Arbenz, was overthrown. My father worked for the government then as an architect and civil engineer in Guatemala. And so I struggled to understand. And so that set me on a course where I find myself today, looking at power relationships, what was the influence of the United States and what went on there, the influence of Germany. Germany was a very important actor in Central America and Guatemala, starting from the 1880s and forward until the Second World War. And they were virtually eliminated during the war. So
yes. One point there about the importance of Guatemala in Latin American history. It is the case that many Central Americans see Guatemala City as the de facto capital of the region. So it is a prominent place. And even though maybe Panama City has risen in more recent times, historically Guatemala City was that political center. Now, your book just covers such a lot of ground. And as you say, Jorge Ubico was president at that time in the book, and you weave a bunch of different stories together to, I guess, discuss the class structure, the role of the Catholic Church in the country, the tension between the various indigenous communities and the desire for the Spanish to, I guess, integrate them into the society. And I hate to say it, but a lot of these themes seem like they have continued.
Well, there's these sort of top-down kinds of efforts at reform, or whatever you want to call it. They go way back. I mean, my ancestor, Manuel Lisandro Barillas, he started seizing land that had belonged to the Indians in perpetuity, and they had documents to prove that were there. It was theirs. And they came to the capital in 1888, thousands of people begging him, please let us keep our lands. Don't steal it from us again. There was even a push to force them to wear the clothing that the government decided they should wear, rather than wearing the clothing that
traditional garments.
Tradition. No, you should wear European clothing. And Ubico, for example, he forced impoverished Indians to purchase white lab coats so they could sell in the marketplaces. He of course, he ran the country like it was his personal fiefdom. It was eventually actually the middle class that revolted against him, because of the onerous controls and the secret police that he inherited from his predecessors.
And
he even had a murderer. He kept a murderer in prison and he would put him on release to kill people that he had designated.
Okay, and in the book Shaken Earth, there's just a lot in it. I think from memory it's around 560 pages.
Yeah, it's a long book.
And so you take various characters throughout the different ports. I think Puerto Cortes maybe in Honduras, into Havana. Yeah, and so it's just a very rich, let's say, tapestry or description of the region at the time. And one of the themes is this, let's say, engagement with foreign powers, right? Especially the Germans. And you even mentioned Japanese involvement, just briefly. Now, let's just first deal with the Germans, though. As you mentioned, there is a little known, there was a German role, definitely more, it's very visible in Chile and Argentina, but throughout Latin America, there has been a German role, and it's not necessarily well understood. And you made that a prominent theme in the book. Why was that?
Well, one of the things I wanted to do was to show the reader that, Central America is really not that far away. It's closer to Texas than California.
Sure.
And it had, at the time, you had United Fruit, which was like the Apple of the time. I mean, imagine, it's still the case. You can buy a banana in the United States. It's brought to you from a couple of thousand miles away or whatever it is. It costs you less than an apple that came from 30 miles away. And it required tremendous understanding of botany, of plant diseases, and so forth. And Guatemala was the center of it. There was of that kind of technology. So the Germans, their role was in coffee. Even though the United States was one of the biggest consumers, the Germans were very much involved in the planting of coffee, the grading of coffee, and exporting it to Europe. And those relationships continued forever. I had my godfather, for example, he sold to the same Germans from before the Second World War all the way until his passing in the 1990s. These are long-term relationships, and so I tried to show that with family ties and not vilifying Germans.
Just describing what was happening,
right?
Not really passing moral judgments on anyone there.
Yeah, there's plenty. I mean, there's a character who is passing in it. He's actually another historical figure along with Ubico, was a German Lutheran pastor who lived in Guatemala. And in 1933, he was called home to Germany, where he became a prominent Nazi. He makes an appearance in the book.
Yeah, in some ways, it's a bit of a tragedy that the German presence in Guatemala has really taken a step back. Although, of course, there are still German schools,
right,
but
I taught at the German school.
Yeah, what happened to the German presence in Guatemala? My understanding was that a lot of them were basically forced to leave during the Second World War. Is that correct?
That's correct. Once Guatemala declared war on Germany, which it was forced to do,
Sure.
they turned their production of sugar, citronella, cotton, coffee, whatever it was, to the United States, declared war, and the United States sent FBI agents. They combed the country looking for German nationals. Now, Germans, on the whole, when they're living overseas, even if they have children born there, much like Americans, they want them to have German citizenship. So
Sure.
They were declared enemy nationals. And so their properties were forfeit to the government. They were sent away. In fact, there were instances of German Jews who narrowly escaped being sent to their certain death in Germany. They were German nationals, but according to the United States government and the Guatemalan government, oh well, they're enemy nationals, we should send them back to Germany. Fortunately, there were some State Department officials who decided, well, let's send them to Texas instead. So they had to live with Nazis up there in Texas and the camps. So their much of their business ties were allayed during the war, and it took decades for them to recover. But there's still families there.
So yeah, some people escaped that net trying to remove Germans from Guatemala.
especially if they'd become Guatemalan nationals.
Right, right. Yeah, and you're right that people in Guatemala, for whatever reason, and maybe you want to touch upon this, do tend to retain their loyalties. There's even an Italian club in Guatemala City that, so if you have an Italian passport, you can become a member. And it's just strange. You think how many Italians are hanging out in Guatemala City, but enough of them to have a lovely, basically, country club of their own. So, yeah. So it is, this forging of a identity in Guatemala is just a persistent theme that is confusing. And yeah, so your book touches upon the foreign engagement, and you do make one mention or a brief mention of a Japanese role. Do you want to talk about that? Where is it more just speculation?
I'm trying to, it's been 3 years since I wrote the book, and I can speak to one aspect is there was one of the earliest photographers in Guatemala was a Japanese,
Yes.
Man, and he, I can't remember his name, but he, became a Catholic, a sincere Catholic, and he was famous for, making, doing portraits, but also portraits of dead babies, which is kind of a macabre, sort of thing, but it was, back in the early part of the 20th century, it was something that, he did. And in fact, I have a photograph of my grandparents, there, on their wedding day that was taken by him.
Wow. Okay. Well, and one of the just precious elements of a fiction work is that you can be more, let's say, politically incorrect, right? You can just tell it like it is. And as I say, you're not really passing judgment. You're just describing what's happening or the way things were. And do you mind sharing which particular elements do you think of this story would be hard to say in a non-fiction setting, right? So whether it's the class structure, the struggling for identity of the Ladino people, or the mestizo people, which elements do you think that you wanted to inject that perhaps are best presented in a work of fiction?
Well, to write the book, to write this novel, I've read histories, anthropologies, geology, and there are stories that, as you said, are best told perhaps from a fictional point of view because there's no documentation. A historian relies on written proof, but you might not know what led to the decisions that were made and that were recorded. It's something that I call the black box. How was it that this came about? So I think interrelationships of people, how they're able to, they have an identity, but they're able to perhaps surpass that. And that's something that I present in the book is you have this elite couple, and because of circumstances, they find themselves in unfamiliar territory, and they have to turn to people who they might not have thought would be there for them. So for example, there's a passage, a sequence in the book where one of the two protagonists, Mariano, has been reduced to a very, very sorry state, and he returns and he's walking down the street and people don't recognize him, people that he knows. And it's a shock to him. These are kinds of internal kind of mechanisms that might not make it
Yeah,
into
one of the elements which stuck out to me of the story, like you said, the chief. I mean, there are different stories that basically cross paths throughout. So it's almost like a Love Actually scenario, that film, where there are these different stories within a story, and they at various points they cross paths. But the main central story is of a young couple that are somewhat privileged class, but you paint the picture of how that is not set in stone, and they're very conscious of this, of trying to maintain it and planning ahead. And it shows that obviously that status or level of preeminence or aristocrat status in the country was very important to one's success, and also preserving family lines and loyalties. And often foreigners may not appreciate how important family lineage is in a place like Guatemala. So if we can fast forward to today, where Guatemala in some way is a country living beyond its own borders, right? Where there's a huge diaspora population.
That's correct.
And I remember I went to a concert there, and there was this bizarre kind of paradox maybe of people showing great pride in being Chapin or Guatemalan. And they have this song, Soy Chapin de Sangre, basically, I'm a Chapin, I'm a Guatemalan by blood. And then they're also saying thank you to all those living outside for maintaining us, or mantenernos, for keeping us going. Because, of course, about a fifth of the Guatemalan economy is simply remittances from abroad. Right. It's an incredible amount of money, given that it's only, let's say, a small minority of the population. It's a minority of the population living abroad and then sending their surplus cash back to Guatemala, and that's enough to basically put a huge bump to the economy. Now, this creates all sorts of confusion as to what Guatemalan identity is, and when people are living abroad for even generations, like you are to some degree, what are they clinging to? So, if people go into your book, what message or what sense of identity, if there is any coherent one, are you sharing about Guatemala? Because I read the book and really found it illuminating, gave me a sense for the history, but I don't know if you think there's a coherent theme, whether it's the strength of the Catholic Church or the political upheaval that seems to be ongoing. How can we relate these themes to today?
I think one of the things I was trying to put across is solidarity. It's the book is divided into two volumes, so to speak, and
yes,
from the first volume is only the two protagonists who are brought over to the second. That's Mariano and Soledad. And what you find is people going beyond themselves, beyond their identity, out of human solidarity. You have this fallen priest who takes pity on Soledad and abandons his ambitions to help. There is a pivotal figure who is appealed on the basis of morality. Please help, and he does. Mariano had been a tough guy, a mercenary, and yet he's been reduced to relying on a boy to get him to safety. It's something I'd wish Guatemalans would think about, to embrace, is to reach out beyond class, for example, beyond ethnic markers. And I think that can only be through embracing human freedom and the value of the individual. So often these systems, Marxism, for example, that would crush the individual for the sake of the mass, it's Guatemala's paid a terrible price for it. On the other side, I'd say the privileged class, all too often, they don't adhere to the morality that they espouse, and allow people at the bottom to perhaps move up.
They don't allow a meritocracy at times.
Right.
There's maybe a protected class, or a sort of almost like an internal form of protectionism.
Buena familia, as they say in Spanish, the good family.
Right.
And I would ask the privileged class, why don't you want these other people to become as wealthy and successful as you are? It's a pity. It's a terrible pity that there is such a crime in Guatemala City when the rest of the country is not nearly at that level. Government is, you have bad government, and government that doesn't secure the rights or the safety of the majority. It's, that a child can be murdered in front of his kindergarten because a gang is extorting the owner of the kindergarten, is just, it should blow their minds. How is that possible?
Yeah, look, yeah. So these are very sensitive issues, because first, I think it was last year, there was a news story that there was a day during which there was no reported murder in Guatemala City, and basically no one could remember when that had ever happened before, right?
Right.
And so murder is just part of life, basically, there. And also, even someone as benign as a dentist will be getting calls and threats of extortion.
Right.
And so my dentist, for example, in Guatemala City would not list her phone number or address or anything on the internet or anywhere, really. It was almost like just word of mouth to come and get her services. It really is a profound part of the society, this extortion and violence. And
it was not that way 30 years ago. It's only gotten worse.
Okay.
Back then, it was more the politicians who were targeted. The American ambassador, the German ambassador. You had conflict up in the mountains between the leftists and the army. The army's retaliations. What I find curious is a kind of a whitewashing of the army. Certainly no fan of communists, but
sure.
What was the alternative being offered to people, the majority of the people?
So go ahead.
Rather than capitalism, or democratic capitalism, it's a oligarchical mercantilism.
Right. Mercantilism is a word that really does apply to Guatemala and many Latin American countries, where there is this not necessarily centrally planned economy, but definitely protected class. So even one of your hopes for Guatemala is that there can be some kind of more unified Guatemalan identity that respects the individual and meritocracy, rather than being so just starkly divided.
And I think that can only come from valuing the individual, holding the individual as sacred. I'll get Christian here. It's every individual is an icon of God.
Sure.
And so that has to be recognized. It can't merely be words in the Constitution. It has to be shown that yes, this is what government is for. It's here to protect your rights. It's to protect you from assaults from criminal organizations. People in Guatemala deserve it. To me, it could be like Switzerland in the tropics. It's an incredibly beautiful country. There are few places in the world, and I've lived in South America, I've visited Europe, I've been all over the United States. There are few places that have such, for example, just the variety of climates. Up in Quetzaltenango, people grow wheat and they grow apples. Down on the coast, they have bananas. In the middle level, they've got coffee, every fruit imaginable. You have the lakes. It's a beautiful place. And I think all too often there are those, I would say, I can speak to the left, who see Guatemalan history as a melodrama. I like to say it's a perhaps even a tragical comedy. Because you have heroes, yet they're perhaps not the most prominent people. And the left always holds up Arbenz, the president from 52 to 54, as this, the Solon of democracy. He was another military officer who probably had one of his associates murdered the year before his election, Arana, and manipulated by his limousine or liberal wife, I like to say caviar communist wife, who was from El Salvador and from the elite. And yet he thought he was going to be accepted by the communists, yet when he was in Cuba in the early 60s, Castro held him out as a look at this failure. This is what happens when you resign. So that's a pathetic case. It's mixed. There was no restoration of democracy in 54. It was status quo ante, where you had a string of army officers, with the exception of Méndez Montenegro, who was murderous in his own way, again imposed by the United States for its own reasons. And again, the United States, it's fumbling, and it's hard to say whether everything. I can't imagine that everything the United States has done officially in Guatemala or Central America has been for the best. And even now, you have the State Department flying the gay liberation flag in Guatemala City from the embassy, and regardless of what one thinks of what that means, or the issues of free speech and so forth, in a country as traditionalist as Guatemala, where 90% of the people are practicing Christians, that's not the way to influence the country positively. And then interfering with its judicial process, with its legal process. That's, again, it's a top-down kind of effort that is bound to fail and only cause further resentment.
Yeah, it's one of those themes that Steve Hecht, our editor-at-large, writes about all the time. This sowing of discord from the United States and other foreign powers, right, with their embassies and foreign aid, and how they get in the way of the rule of law and some sort of unified Guatemala, because they pit the classes or different groups against each other. Now, and that's just an ongoing problem. Why don't you share with us your, reflections now that the book has been out for a couple of years, and whether you're working on another one. What's the future of modern Barillas author?
Well, I'm making notes and taking names. I have to think what would be most palatable to English speaking readers. Although I've had a few native Spanish speaking people who really enjoyed it. I've thought to bring the story forward, if not the characters, to the 1980s, which is a period that I'm familiar with. I would really love to do something on American leftists and their conceits in Central America. The people that we called sandinistas. These were people like Bill de Blasio, who went to Nicaragua and lived quite well, espousing the leftist agenda of the murderous Sandinistas in Nicaragua. They weren't tolerated in Guatemala, and they wouldn't have had much of but they were there. You had the backpackers coming through. That would be an area I think I would like to examine.
Yeah, that is fertile ground, I must say, for another work of fiction that would give the context to help people make history more attractive. Because one thing I say in my review of your book, which we'll include in the show notes, is that history for many people seems like such a dry topic, and this work of fiction just brings it alive. It makes it so exciting and entertaining, and so it's a much more amenable form of history. And of course, the 70s and 80s, with the Fidel Castro influence, trying to basically overthrow governments and install little Cubas around Latin America, just makes for a lot of drama, a lot of violence, unfortunately, and there's a lot of space for explaining this through fiction to a foreign audience.
Yeah, there's so many stories, that I think that I know of, where I lived, in Guatemala and Central America, and that I served in Buenos Aires, and I see some of the same issues there. It's such a highly civilized people. I've seldom met people who are as well read as Argentines, yet they've got a crazy economy, and they're benighted by Peronism. It's like a cancer that they can't get rid of.
Yeah, I've actually written about Peronismo and the way Argentina basically needs an amputation to just cut that piece of history out, that whole ideology or way of thinking out of the country, because it has been just debilitating for the last few decades, this centralization of power and giving union control over many industries. So get the book, Shaken Earth by Martin Barillas. That you can see he's got the lovely new cover there right behind him. I read this one in full and gave my own review. And as I said, especially at the time, because I think I read it when I just moved to Guatemala, it proved to be useful just for giving me a richer understanding of how things came to be. So it is a wonderful story of history and a way for people to get a sense for Guatemala and Central America, with many themes carrying through to today. So I hope you do work on another book. Obviously, Martin, I likewise appreciate your work, and I look forward to the next one. So thank you for your time, mate.
Thank you, Fergus, and I wish you every success in your endeavors. It's really great to see this kind of journalism.